Hello, I'm Chad Johnson with Truss Components of Washington. I've been in the truss industry for over 30 years. Today, I am excited to talk to you about pre-framed wood wall panels. We'll talk about the advantages of using them and how they can help you with your next project. Okay, let's start out with some definitions. You might be wondering, what is a pre-framed wood wall panel? And the answer is pretty straightforward. So typically when you build a house, let's say we would call this an L-shape house, and you've got a garage and you've got living space, and then you're going to have walls that go all the way around. Need something to put your roof on and keep the weather out. Well, those are typically framed with 2x6 studs for the exteriors, 2x4s for any interiors. And on site, the framer will lay out all the parts after they carry them from piles that the lumber yard has left around the job site. They'll carry those pieces to where they need to frame the walls, and then they'll put them together and stand them up. And that way you end up with a set of walls to support your roof and all that sort of thing. Now, when we do a pre-framed wall panel, what we do is we take this exterior and interior plan, and then we build those walls in sections in a controlled environment in a factory, and then we bring them out to the job site so they can just be set in place very quickly. And you might also wonder, how do they fit into modern home construction? Well, as you're aware, people are busy. We need to get things done in a short timeline. And the difference between a pre-framed wall panel system versus framing on site is it's usually about half of the time to do the installation of the walls as it would be to frame it on site. So it helps reduce the time that it takes to build a structure. And that's where wall panels really fit in the modern build. So as we talked about a little bit, you could frame a structure on a job site, or you could frame a structure in a factory and then assemble it on a job site. What are the differences? Well, here are a few. One is that on a job site, the walls are going to be framed in lengths that make sense to stand up on the job site. And with typical job site methods, which is essentially like jacking them up from a horizontal position into a vertical, and they're going to be built in the weather, whether it's good weather or bad weather. They may get wet and then dry and get wet again. When we build them in a factory, we use the same framing techniques. So like we talked about, 2x6 exterior studs, plywood or OSB shear nailed per the plans that the engineer provides us, but we build them in lengths that we can ship down the road and install on site, kind of like a puzzle. So going back to this structure that we talked about here, we might build wall panels that are in various lengths, and then we just work our way around the structure until the entire structure is standing and ready to put a roof on, and sheetrock and electrical and all the other things that come following the walls. Okay, we're just going to dive into some comparison between site framing versus off-site framing. And we're going to talk about the timeline on the project. We're going to talk about the quality of the product. We're going to talk about the safety. We're going to talk about waste. There are a lot of advantages to the off-site framing. So typically, when you frame a project on site, ahead of the start of the frame, your lumber company is going to need to drop off the materials. So let's say we get out here in the driveway a pile of lumber, various sizes. we're going to get a pile of plywood or OSB. We're going to get boxes of nails and hangers and hardware and all that stuff dropped off. So at least the day before they start, you hope this stuff is there. Sometimes the framer shows up to start and the material hasn't arrived yet, and that's a whole different scenario. But anyway, let's assume that these materials show up on time, probably a couple of days ahead of the frame start, so they are out there exposed to the weather. Additionally, usually they're going to be dropped in the driveway, someplace that there's access to drop the materials, because a big truck needs to bring that stuff in. They might offload it with a forklift, or they might just dump it off. But either way, if your house is back here behind your garage, all of the material is up here in front of your garage, it's going to take a lot of time and a lot of energy to move all those materials to where they belong on the job site in order to frame those walls. Additionally, once those walls are framed, the framers are going to need to stand them. So I don't know how many times I've been out on a job site measuring for roof trusses or some other reason, and they're like, hey, come over here and help us stand this wall. And the framers are out there with this wall that's 30 feet long and weighs a couple of 1,000 pounds, and they need some help because they've got 3 or 4 guys out there to stand that thing up. Boy, that is hard on the back. Additionally, they could be using wall jacks, which are a tool that they can attach to the top of the wall and they attach to the floor, and they can raise the walls using those jacks. But every now and then, the material that they're using with those jacks breaks and those walls fall. As a matter of fact, a few years ago, one of the framers that I worked with quite a bit had one of those wall jacks break, and the wall fell down on his foot, and he was out of work for about 6 weeks. So a lot of strain on the back, a lot of bending down and carrying materials around, and then the potential for some pretty major injury. I guess we talked a little bit about the fact that all of this is exposed to the weather during that entire build. And then what we didn't touch on yet is the fact that as all of this is being framed on site, we're using this random length material and cutting off parts that we don't need. One framer might build a house one way and another framer might build a house a little bit differently. And so your material list might have too much material, which means you're going to have returns, or maybe you don't have enough material out there, and then you're going to end up with delays and extra expenses getting new material. And then, like we mentioned, they're going to be cutting off and creating waste. A site framed home creates a lot of waste that has to be paid to be hauled off. So those are site framing conditions. Well, let's talk about an off-site framing wall panel package that is brought to the job site. So the framers would still typically get their material for the floor ahead of time, but then once they have that floor installed and ready for the wall panels, we're going to bring those wall panels out on a truck, essentially right when the framers are ready for them. So those wall panels will come out pre-framed. They were made in a factory with controlled conditions, so built out of the weather. And when they show up on site, they're going to be dry, they're going to be precise and ready to install. So depending on the site conditions, we may set those wall panels in place with our boom truck, and that saves so much lifting, so much labor, so much motion getting all of those parts where they go. And additionally, it's very safe because all of the weight is being carried by the boom truck. If that's not practical, then the walls can still be moved to place by hand, but they're going to be smaller sections than what would typically be framed on site. And so they're lighter, easier to move around, much safer. So once those walls are in place, they're ready to get a roof put on them, often the day after they show up. And so they have much less exposure to the elements, which will reduce the expense of removing moisture from the building after it is dried in order to do insulation and sheetrock and those sort of things. But additionally, all of the materials that are in those wall panels were very carefully optimized, selected for only the amount that needed to be used. The sheathing is nested into pieces so that we get the most that we can out of a sheet of material. And so we produce very little waste in the plant, and on site, there is essentially no waste because the wall panels come out just the way they need to be, and there just isn't much to do with them beyond that point. So you may be wondering, what can I expect when I receive a wall panel package on my project? And it's pretty straightforward. You're going to have ahead of time a layout that has the location and the labeling for all of the wall panels, as well as it'll show bundles and where they should be set on site in order to get them close to where they're going to be used. And on that layout, it's sort of like a puzzle with instructions, because each label corresponds to a wall panel, and so it shows exactly where they go. Now, one of the things that we do is we build our wall panels about 1/8 of an inch shorter than what they are specified on the plans, and that allows for slight variances in material sizes, variances in the accuracy of the floor framing, and that sort of thing. So it's a good idea to make sure that you are using a tape measure as you set the wall panels out. And that's one of the probably the most common pitfalls with using wall panels, is not using a tape measure, just setting everything end to end to end and not checking, and ending up on a run of wall panels being a little bit short. But even if that's the case, it's really not a big deal to fill out the end of that last wall panel just a touch. So like I said ahead of time, you'll get that layout that shows where everything goes. And then our boom operator will offload the wall panels in bundles close to where they're going to be used. And then if conditions allow, we will individually set the exterior wall panels in place. So the on-site laborers will receive the wall panels and they'll brace them in place. And then the interior wall panels, which don't have plywood or OSB on them, they're much lighter, they'll actually be set inside the building on the floor, very close to where they're going to be used, in bundles. And then the laborers on site will move the individual walls to where they go, stand them up and brace them off. And so a typical timeline on a single story, let's say 2,000 square foot house, is our delivery would show up in the morning. Let's say we're on site at 8 a.m. We would be done delivering around noon. Your labor could put the interior walls in place and top plate the exterior and interior walls, either in the afternoon on the same day or maybe into the morning of the next day. So it's very common for us to deliver wall panels on one morning and then roof trusses the following afternoon. So essentially a 2-day timeline to have your building framed up and ready for trusses. So the question might come up, how are these wall panels going to integrate with the other framing components on a building? The floor trusses, the roof trusses, those sort of things. So this is a major advantage of using wall panels, is that as the supplier of the wall panels, we would design the wall panels, design the floor trusses, and design the roof trusses all as one package. And so we would be taking into consideration, where do the studs align, so that plumbing and other obstructions that need to go through the walls would be matched up with the trusses, matched up with the floor and roof above. And because we are working with the same designer, the same software, the same set of plans. We know that the floor will match the foundation. We know that the walls will match the floor, and we know that the roof will match the walls. And so it greatly reduces the possibility of one system not fitting or working well with another system. So is my project the right size for wall panels? That is a great question. And I would say yes. So we have supplied wall panels successfully for everything from garages to multi-unit apartment and townhome complexes, dormitories, commercial buildings, individual residences of all different sizes. And from our standpoint, and this would apply to floor systems, roofed systems, wall systems, any big project or any small project is just made up of a lot of small parts. And so that's how we approach it. So yeah, your project is a great candidate for wall panels. So aside from the question of the size of a project, sometimes people ask, is my project too complex for wall panels? And in all honesty, there are some situations where the wall panel may not be the best solution, but that's pretty rare. When we do run into that, we'll be totally honest about it. We're happy to say this section should be panelized, this section should be framed on site. And when we run into that situation where there's something that should be framed on site, we can make that part easy too, because we can design and pre-cut all of the framing parts for that section, deliver them to the job site with instructions on how they go together, and it just makes framing of that section a breeze. So another question that you might be asking is, in my climate or in my environment, are wall panels a good solution? And I would say yes, regardless of where you are. And here's why I would say that. It's because wall panels make the framing process faster. So if you are in a dry climate, the wall panels are going to make that framing process very quick, and you're going to be able to move on to the next set of trades and get your project done faster. If you're in a wet climate, those wall panels are going to help the project go more quickly, which means that the materials are going to be less wet. And so when it comes time to move on to insulation or drywall, there's going to be less effort necessary to make the product dry enough to move on to those next trades. So first off, the way the wall panel timeline works is a little bit different than the way an on-site framing timeline works. So it's pretty typical with a on-site framing project. If we're looking at the timeline on the project, it might look like this: planning, and then construction, and then move-in. And the planning process can have some questions left unanswered because on site, we can make up answers to those questions, so to speak. Not necessarily the most economical way to manage a project, because if you have questions while you're in construction, you might not be able to make the most cost-effective decision, or someone may just make judgment calls. The framer on site could just be making things work and not communicating with the builder. So the difference between that scenario where we have a lot of flexibility on site, but flexibility can lead to potentially money wasting decisions being made. When we do a off-site construction or prefabricated, it's going to look a little bit more like this. That timeline of planning is going to extend because we want to make sure that we cover all of the details before we start into fabrication. But then that timeline for construction it's going to start a little further out here, but it's going to be much shorter. So the end result is that the move-in happens faster, even though the planning was longer. And during that planning period, we want to get all of the details worked out, because it's much easier to work out details in a computer program or on paper than it is with the finished product. Another thing to consider is that with the prefabricated wall panels, less skilled labor is needed on site. Not no skilled labor, but less skilled labor. So with one experienced carpenter on site, they can lead a crew of just a few people that don't have a lot of experience. And so in today's labor market, where it's difficult to find people that have framing experience, and the ones that are good at what they do are expensive, we can have less of those necessary in order to get a project completed and completed well. So when we think about the amount of labor that it takes to put together a prefabricated project and the reduced overall timeline from the beginning of planning to the end of construction, one great benefit, in addition to all the rest, is that we can get more projects done in the same period of time without expending more labor. So if you consider project that has maybe a superintendent, a foreman, a few framing crews, that sort of thing, and that superintendent is managing, let's say 12 home builds a year. Could be 12, could be 120, but anyway, let's just take that 12, for example. During that year, if that same superintendent and those same framing crews could get their projects done in, let's just say 20% less time, well, that means now we're going to have enough time to do another 2 to 3 builds during that year with the same amount of labor. And so that is just savings or additional money for the builder. If you're a homeowner, then you can have less labor on site. You can be in your home sooner, and in the end, it will cost you less using wall panels than framing on site. Well, thanks for watching this video. If you would like to learn more about off-site construction and prefabricated wall panels, take a look at this video here, which has a time lapse of a single family home being built with wall panels. You can take a look at this video here, which has all that you would need to know about roof trusses, or you can take a look at this video here, which explains everything that you might need to know about floor trusses.